On a snowy Christmas Eve in Seattle, billionaire Jonathan Hale sits alone in a luxury restaurant, haunted by years of loss and isolation. But everything changes when a young girl approaches his table and tells him no one should spend Christmas alone. Her simple kindness and the presence of her struggling single mother sets in motion a chain of events that will transform all their lives. At 74 years old, Jonathan Hale had everything a man could dream of, at least according to the world, outside the tall glass walls of his penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle. He was the founder and sole owner of Hale Properties, one of the largest real estate development empires on the West Coast. And for decades the name Hale had been synonymous with power, success, and uncompromising precision. Yet all the money, all the properties, all the loyal employees and board members who revered him meant almost nothing as another year drew to a close. On this particular Christmas Eve, the city glittered with holiday lights reflecting off fresh snow. Families filled the streets with laughter. Couples walked hand in hand, and across the skyline, warmth seemed to radiate from every window except Jonathan's. His penthouse, immaculate and expansive, looked more like a museum than a home, its pristine surfaces and perfectly curated art doing little to disguise how empty the space truly was. 6 years earlier, Jonathan had lost his wife, Eleanor, a woman who had balanced his ambition with compassion, who had fought relentlessly for him to slow down, to rest, to live a life that wasn't entirely consumed by work. They had been married for 48 years, nearly 5 decades of shared dreams, triumphs, arguments, reconciliations, and the private tenderness that existed behind their public image. Eleanor's death had not been long or dramatic. It was a sudden heart attack, a phone call in the middle of a meeting, a moment that shattered everything Jonathan believed was permanent. It was the first time in his life he felt powerless. For a man who controlled empires, who built skyscrapers and negotiated billion-dollar deals, grief was an opponent he couldn't outthink, outmaneuver, or intimidate. It simply arrived and it stayed. The accident followed a year later, as if tragedy had decided to take residence in his life. Jonathan had always insisted on driving himself, even into his late 60s, refusing chauffeurs unless required for public events. One December night, still raw from Eleanor's absence, he lost control of his car on an icy road while returning from a late meeting. The crash was violent, flipping the vehicle and crushing the driver's side. He survived, but the spinal damage left him dependent on a wheelchair for years spent in painful recovery, physical therapy sessions that pushed him to the brink, and long nights staring at ceilings, wondering how a man who once commanded so much strength could now struggle simply to stand. Though he eventually regained partial mobility and could walk short distances with a cane, the injury changed him. It wasn't only the physical limitation. It was the vulnerability he felt each time he faced a staircase or a slippery sidewalk. The frustration of relying on others for tasks he once performed effortlessly, and the awareness that his body was aging faster than he was prepared to accept. He became quieter, more withdrawn, choosing the safety of solitude rather than the risk of letting others witness his struggle. And over time, solitude became habit. Worse than the physical pain was the damage the accident did to his relationship with his son, Lucas. The father and son had never been close. Jonathan had been married to his career long before Lucas entered the world, but after Eleanor's death, their already fragile relationship deteriorated. Lucas blamed Jonathan for working too much, for not being present, for leaving Eleanor to navigate a lifetime of loneliness disguised behind charity galas and immaculate dinner parties. Jonathan, in turn, resented the accusation, insisting he had provided everything a family could need. Neither man was entirely wrong, and neither was entirely right, but the truth didn't matter once pride took root. Eventually, Lucas moved to Chicago with his wife and children, calling only on holidays out of obligation. Even those calls grew shorter each year, reduced to a scripted exchange of greetings that left both men feeling hollow. On this Christmas Eve, Jonathan hadn't heard from his son at all. And so, wrapped in the thick quiet of a high-rise that felt more like a monument to his past than a home for his present, Jonathan stared out at the glowing city below. Snowflakes drifted against the windows in soft, deliberate spirals. Somewhere far below, the sound of a distant Christmas choir rose through the cold night air. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine Eleanor beside him, her hand slipping into his, her gentle voice teasing him for refusing to acknowledge how lonely he'd become. He imagined her urging him to go out, to surround himself with people, to stop hiding from a world that had once thrilled him. It was a thought that made him smile for the first time in days. That was why he decided, almost impulsively, to go out for dinner. The best restaurants were fully booked weeks in advance, but for a man like Jonathan Hale, tables appeared as if by magic. A black car service arrived within minutes, and he allowed himself to be helped into the back seat, a gesture he hated but tolerated. He gazed out the window as they drove through snow-lined streets, watching children tug their parents' hands, teenagers taking photos with oversized Christmas displays, couples sharing scarves, and groups of friends carrying steaming cups of cocoa. Every face he glimpsed seemed touched by the same bright joy that had been missing from his life for so long. It wasn't the comparison that hurt, it was the reminder of everything he once had and everything he lost. When he arrived at the restaurant, a warm, wood-paneled establishment overlooking Elliott Bay, he was greeted instantly by name. The hostess, barely 30, smiled brightly as though her cheer could somehow reach him, but Jonathan felt none of it. He requested a table in the corner, away from the crowds, and the staff hurried to accommodate. Once seated, he looked out at the families talking over holiday feasts, listening to the delicate clinking of glasses, the bursts of laughter, the quiet hum of conversation. A few patrons recognized him, offering polite nods or whispering his name with awe. But their admiration only deepened the sense of distance he felt from them. His meal sat untouched, the prime rib cooled on its plate, the wine remained full in its glass. Jonathan folded his hands, staring at them the way a man examines a relic of his former life, remembering a time when those hands could carry beams, lift boxes, build homes, hold his wife close. Now, they trembled slightly from the cold he could never quite shake. It wasn't despair he felt, it was something softer, heavier, a quiet realization settling deep in his chest. This was what his life had become. Wealth without warmth, success without company. A lifetime of accomplishments overshadowed by the absence of the people who once gave those accomplishments meaning. And for the first time, he wondered whether this loneliness was the inevitable price of the choices he'd made, or if, perhaps, it wasn't too late to rewrite the ending of his story. Jonathan's attention drifted toward the entrance of the restaurant just as the heavy wooden doors swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and a flurry of snowflakes. He barely noticed at first people had been coming and going all evening, bundled in scarves and thick coats, laughing as they brushed snow from their hair. But something about the small figure who entered next drew his eyes against his will. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, stepped inside, her blonde hair in slightly messy braids and her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. She wore a puffy lavender coat that looked a year too small, the zipper wobbling loosely as she tugged it down. She paused, hesitating as she looked around the restaurant with wide blue eyes that absorbed everything: the candles on the tables, the glittering ornaments, the bustling waitstaff. She held her breath the way children sometimes do when entering someplace that feels much grander than anything they reused to. Behind her came a woman in her early 30s, wearing worn jeans and a forest green coat that had clearly seen better winters. Her boots were scuffed, patches of melted snow clinging to the sides, and her nails were short and clean, the kind that belonged to someone who worked with her hands every day. She brushed melting snow from her shoulders and offered her daughter a reassuring smile before approaching the host stand. Jonathan watched them because he sensed something familiar in the mother's posture, something tired, careful, protective, as though she carried not only her own weight but her child's world as well. The hostess greeted them politely, but Jonathan could see the flicker of concern cross her face, the kind that appeared when someone wearing thrift store clothes stepped into a restaurant where the cheapest entry cost more than an average day's wages. The little girl didn't seem to notice any tension. She was too busy turning slowly, taking in the gleaming chandeliers and the roaring fireplace across the room. Jonathan found himself leaning forward slightly, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was the innocence in her expression, a kind of hopefulness he hadn't seen in years. The hostess explained softly that the restaurant was fully booked for the evening, her voice polite but strained. Jonathan saw the mother nod before she even finished, as though she had expected the rejection before stepping through the door. The woman thanked her anyway, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's back to guide her toward the exit. But the little girl's eyes weren't watching the hostess or the door, they were focused on Jonathan. Anna had spotted him the second they walked in, sitting alone at a beautifully set table meant for two. She noticed the untouched food, the still, full glass of wine, and the look on the old man's face that didn't match the cheerful glow of the room. Children see things adults don't, and Anna saw loneliness before anyone else did. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, whispering something that made the woman turn to glance briefly in Jonathan's direction. Her expression softened, but she shook her head gently and tried to encourage her daughter toward the door. But Anna didn't move. Instead, with the decisive confidence only young children possess, she slipped away from her mother's grasp and walked straight toward Jonathan's table. Laura froze for a second, startled, then hurried after her, whispering for her daughter to stop. But Anna was already standing beside Jonathan, peering up at him with curious eyes. Jonathan, pulled abruptly from his thoughts, blinked down at the little girl. She was tiny, no taller than the height of his chair, her gloved hands clutching the strap of a small purple backpack decorated with glittering stars. There was no shyness in her gaze, only concern, pure and unfiltered. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice completely earnest. Jonathan felt something stir inside him, an emotion he hadn't felt in a very long time, and it caught him off guard. Children didn't approach him, not in public, not in private, not ever. He had never been the warm, approachable type. He was the man people respected, feared, envied, but rarely comforted. "I'm all right," he murmured, his tone softer than he intended. "Thank you for asking." "You look sad," Anna said simply, with the straightforward honesty of a child who hasn't yet learned the art of filtering her truth. Before Jonathan could respond, Laura caught up, bending slightly to place a careful hand on her daughter's shoulder. Her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir. She didn't mean to bother you." Jonathan shook his head. "She's not bothering me." He turned to the little girl again. "What made you think I was sad?" Anna glanced at the empty chair across from him. "Because nobody should be alone on Christmas." The words hit him with surprising force. For 6 years, every holiday had been spent exactly this way, in isolation, pretending it didn't matter, pretending it didn't hurt. But somehow, hearing that truth from a child made all the walls he'd built feel thin and fragile. Anna reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of construction paper. "I made this today," she said proudly. "It was for my mom, but I think you need it more." Jonathan accepted the card with hands that suddenly felt less steady. As he opened it, he saw 3 stick figures drawn with crayon, 2 tall figures, and 1 small one between them, all holding hands under a Christmas tree. Above them, in big shaky letters, were the words "Family is love." His throat tightened unexpectedly. He hadn't expected anything from this night, not conversation, not connection, not a reminder of everything he'd lost. And yet here it was, delivered by a child whose kindness had no concept of wealth or status or the walls adults build around themselves. Laura, hovering protectively behind her daughter, spoke quietly. "She made that earlier today. Christmas crafts." She offered an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry again. She has a big heart and sometimes forgets boundaries." Jonathan shook his head again. "It's a beautiful card." Anna brightened at that, rocking on her heels. "Do you want to sit with us?" she asked. Laura stiffened. Anna. The restaurant seemed to pause around them. The idea was absurd, unimaginable, and yet, at that moment, something inside Jonathan cracked open. A small voice inside him whispered that this unlikely encounter might be the first real moment of human connection he'd had in years. He looked at Laura, whose eyes revealed embarrassment, caution, and exhaustion all woven together with a thread of hope she didn't want to acknowledge. In a gentle voice, he asked, "Would you and your daughter like to join me for dinner?" Laura drew a breath, stunned. "Sir, we can't possibly." "You can," Jonathan said, "and I would appreciate the company." Anna looked up at her mother with pleading excitement. Jonathan waited, aware that Laura's pride might force her to decline, aware that he was asking something vulnerable of her, not just himself. Finally, after a long, quiet moment, Laura nodded. "All right," she said softly, "we'd be honored." And just like that, with one small act of courage from a little girl in a lavender coat, the trajectory of all their lives began to shift so quietly and unexpectedly that none of them recognized, in that moment, how profoundly everything was about to change. The moment Laura agreed to join him, something in the atmosphere of the restaurant shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if a string pulled too tight within Jonathan finally loosened. He signaled the waiter with a small gesture, and the young man rushed over with a startled eagerness, clearly unsure what to make of the unlikely trio forming at table 16. Jonathan requested 2 additional place settings, and though the waiter hit it well, there was a flicker of surprise. This was not the kind of restaurant where a billionaire typically invited strangers to dine with him. While the staff rearranged chairs and brought out fresh linens and glasses, Jonathan watched Laura help Anna remove her coat. The mother carefully shook off the remaining snowflakes before draping it over the back of the little girl's chair. Anna slid into her seat immediately, swinging her feet under the table as if she belonged there. As if she couldn't imagine being anywhere else in that moment. Jonathan admired her enthusiasm. It reminded him of a time long before he became the man the world knew, when things like dinner and company mattered more than contracts or budgets. Laura sat more cautiously. She smoothed her coat over her lap and exchanged a hesitant glance with Jonathan. She wasn't intimidated by him, not the way many people were when confronted with the weight of his reputation, but she clearly felt out of place in a room filled with polished silver, formally dressed patrons, and the quiet hum of affluent holiday conversations. Her boots left a faint trace of melted snow on the hardwood floor, and her hands moved in small, controlled motions. The gestures of someone familiar with making herself smaller in spaces she wasn't sure she belonged. But beneath that caution was something strong, something grounded. Laura carried herself with the resilience of a woman who had fought through storms far harsher than a fancy restaurant's judgmental glances. When the menus arrived, Laura barely glanced at hers. She closed it quickly, a subtle attempt to avoid confronting the prices. Jonathan recognized the look immediately. He'd seen it often in the early days of his company, back when he still visited construction sites instead of boardrooms. It wasn't embarrassment or shame, it was calculation. She was trying to avoid imposing, trying to protect her dignity while accepting kindness she hadn't asked for. Before she could decide on the cheapest item, Jonathan leaned slightly forward. "Please," he said, his tone gentle, "order whatever you and your daughter want. It's my treat." Laura hesitated. "That's very generous, but I don't want to take advantage." "You not," Jonathan said. Then he added something he hadn't planned to say. "I haven't had company for Christmas dinner in a very long time. Tonight this means more to me than you know." Laura studied him, her blue eyes softening as she realized he was telling the truth. She nodded slowly. "All right, thank you." Anna wasted no time. "Ma, they have chicken tenders?" Jonathan chuckled. "Good choice, reliable classic." While the waiter jotted down their orders, Jonathan's attention drifted to Laura again. Her eyes were tired, truly tired, in a way he recognized well, but still bright with a quiet determination. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail with strands falling around her face. The practical style of a woman who didn't have time to fuss over appearances. Her hands were rough from work, small scars tracing the knuckles from years of using tools. She exuded capability, reliability, a strength that felt deeply rooted. When the waiter left, Anna pulled a small sketchpad from her backpack and placed it in front of her, flipping it open to a blank page. She reached into a side pocket and triumphantly retrieved a handful of crayons. "Do you like to draw?" Jonathan asked. "Yes," Anna replied. "Mom says I draw everywhere, even on napkins, but only if they were not expensive napkins." The comment made Laura flush. "I'm trying to teach her about boundaries." Jonathan smiled. "Children don't need boundaries on creativity." "That's what she says too," Laura replied with a hint of humor. "But try explaining that to a diner owner who finds little cartoon dogs on his tablecloth." Jonathan let out a genuine laugh, a warm rumble he hadn't heard from himself in months. It startled him slightly. It seemed to startle Laura too, but in a pleasant way. As Anna began drawing a Christmas tree, Jonathan cleared his throat and gently asked, "Do you live here in Seattle?" "Yes," Laura said, "born and raised." "And what do you do, if you don't mind me asking?" Laura shifted slightly in her seat. "I'm a carpenter. I specialize in furniture restoration, old woodwork, antique pieces, that kind of thing." "That's skilled work," Jonathan said, genuinely impressed. "I learned it from my dad," she replied. "He owned a tiny workshop. Nothing fancy, but he could take something broken and make it beautiful again." Her voice softened. "He passed that on to me." Jonathan considered her words. That's a gift. Not many people can restore craftsmanship. Most only know how to replace things, not preserve them. Laura seemed surprised by his understanding. That's exactly how I feel. But companies don't seem to care much about craftsmanship when they hire. They want certifications, degrees, things I don't have. For a moment, the air between them shifted. Jonathan knew what it felt like to be dismissed for not fitting someone else's mold. In his earliest years, before Hale Properties became a titan of Pacific Northwest real estate, he had faced rejection after rejection: banks that wouldn't give loans, competitors who doubted him, politicians who refused zoning approvals because they didn't take him seriously. He had been young, hungry, determined, and underestimated. The difference was that he'd had time and resources to push forward. Laura, he sensed, had neither. He wanted to ask her more about her struggles, her work, her life, but he also sensed that she wasn't the type to willingly expose vulnerabilities to a stranger. So instead, he asked something gentler. "And your daughter?" he said, glancing at Anna. "Just the two of you tonight." Laura took a slow breath. "It's been just the two of us for 2 years now." Jonathan didn't press. He didn't need to. Her tone said enough. There were stories, griefs, burdens she carried quietly, the way strong people often do. Anna lifted her drawing toward them. "Look. It's us." Jonathan examined the picture. 3 figures hand in hand beneath a Christmas tree. One tall man with white hair, one woman with long blonde hair, and a small child between them. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Laura looked at the drawing too. Her lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes shimmered with something deeper, an emotion she quickly blinked away. Dinner arrived, and as they began to eat, conversation flowed more easily. They spoke about woodworking, childhood memories, Seattle winter storms, and the strange comfort of unexpected company. With each passing minute, the restaurant around them faded from Jonathan's awareness. The noise softened, the lights dimmed into a pleasant glow, and the cold space inside his chest warmed. He didn't know what to call this feeling, only that it was something he hadn't felt in years: connection. Humanity. The simple, incomparable warmth of being seen by another person without judgment or expectation. For the first time in a very long time, Jonathan Hale felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. By the time dessert menace appeared, something subtle but unmistakable had changed between the three of them. The tension that usually wrapped itself around Jonathan's shoulders like a heavy winter scarf had begun to unwind, thread by thread. The hollowness that had shadowed him for years eased just enough for warmth to find its way back into him. It didn't feel dramatic or sudden, rather. It felt like the first rays of sunlight after a long Pacific Northwest storm, quiet but transformative. Laura noticed it too, though she pretended not to stare. She had seen enough of the world to recognize loneliness when it sat across from her, and she knew how surprising it could feel when a stranger offered even a momentary reprieve from it. The waiter returned with a smile that was now noticeably more genuine than earlier, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of Jonathan and offering hot chocolate to Anna. The little girl accepted eagerly, wrapping both hands around the mug like it was a treasure made of warmth and sugar. Jonathan found himself charmed by the sight, an unfamiliar tenderness curling through him. "Careful," Laura murmured to her daughter, "it's hot." Anna nodded solemnly but kept sipping, her feet swinging under the table in steady rhythm. Jonathan cleared his throat before speaking again. "Tell me," he said, looking at Laura with genuine curiosity, "how did you and Anna end up out tonight? Most families are home by the fire or opening early gifts." Laura hesitated. She wasn't embarrassed, exactly, but she was used to navigating conversations with a certain protective caution. Slowly she said, "I promised her a special Christmas Eve dinner this year. Something different." She kept her tone light, but Jonathan sensed the deeper truth: this dinner wasn't just a holiday outing. It was a promise made by a mother who had been carrying the world on her shoulders for a long time. "So we tried to find a place that wasn't too expensive," Anna added, oblivious to tension. "But the diner down the street had a sign that said they ran out of food." Laura winced. Jonathan's brows pulled together. "They ran out on Christmas Eve. It's a small diner," Laura explained quickly, as if defending them. "They serve a lot of people in our neighborhood. They did their best." She shrugged. "I told Anna we could go home and make grilled cheese instead. She didn't love that idea." Anna shook her head emphatically. "Nope. I wanted Christmas food, real Christmas food." Jonathan smiled. Chicken tenders and fries count as real Christmas food. Yes, Anna declared with full confidence. Laura laughed softly, and the sound filled something inside Jonathan that had been empty far too long. He leaned back, studying her more openly now. Her cheeks were slightly pink from embarrassment and the warmth of the room. But there was also a spark in her eyes, a spark he imagined had survived every hardship she'd endured. He admired that quietly. When the plates were cleared, Anna returned her focus to her drawing pad. She scribbled intently, adding swirls of color that occasionally drifted off the page and onto the tablecloth. Laura moved to stop her, but Jonathan gently raised a hand. "Let her draw," he said. "A few stray crayon marks won't hurt this place." "Tell that to the owner," Laura murmured with a light grin. "I happen to know the owner," he replied casually, but not in a bragging way. It was simply true. "I'll put in a good word for her." Laura blinked, confused. "You know the owner? How?" "We've worked together for years," he said. "He leases 2 floors of office space in one of my buildings." She froze for a second, realization dawning. Her eyes flicked to him, then to the gold cufflink on his sleeve, then back to his face. "Your buildings," she echoed. Jonathan hesitated. He didn't want this moment to shift into something uncomfortable, but withholding the truth felt worse. "I own Hale Properties," he said. The name landed with the weight of familiarity. Laura had seen it on billboards, construction sites, news articles, the skyline. "As in Hale Tower, Hale Plaza, Hale everything?" she asked. "Pretty much," he admitted with a small smile. She stared. "I had no idea." "Good," he said gently. "I didn't want that to be the reason you agreed to join me tonight." She exhaled slowly. "It wasn't," she said. "Anna made the decision for both of us." Jonathan's gaze softened as he looked at the little girl. "She has good instincts." The next moment came so naturally that Jonathan didn't fully realize what he was doing until the words were already out. "Would you both consider coming to my home tomorrow? Just for an hour?" Laura blinked hard. "Your home?" "Yes," he said. He didn't want to overwhelm her, so he added carefully, "I have something I'd like to discuss with you. And a piano Anna might enjoy." Anna's head snapped up. "A piano? A grand piano?" Jonathan said, "Vintage Steinway." Anna gasped dramatically, "Mom! Please say yes, please." Laura hesitated, looking conflicted. Jonathan didn't push, but he held her gaze with quiet sincerity. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I just enjoyed this. More than I expected. I'd like to see you both again if you're comfortable." Laura's fingers tightened around her napkin. She wasn't accustomed to receiving invitations from billionaire strangers. But she looked from Jonathan to Anna, who was already smiling as if the decision had been made by the universe itself. And in that moment, something softened inside her. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It wasn't trust, not entirely. It was simply a feeling that this man, despite his wealth and status, was lonely in a way she understood too well. "All right," she said quietly, "we can come." Anna beamed, bouncing in her seat. Jonathan felt an unexpected swell of emotion at their acceptance, something between gratitude and relief. Dinner wound down slowly after that, not because they were stalling, but because none of them seemed eager for the evening to end. When Jonathan finally asked for the check, the waiter shook his head politely. "Already taken care of, Mr. Hale, on the house. Merry Christmas." Laura's eyes widened. "He comped your dinner." Jonathan shook his head with a rueful smile. "He comped yours. Mine never gets comped." Anna giggled. "Because you were rich." "Because I tipped too well," Jonathan corrected lightly. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in glittering white. Jonathan watched Laura help Anna into her coat, tying her scarf carefully, brushing snowflakes from her hair. Her movements were tender, practiced, full of the love that came from doing everything alone for far too long. Something in his chest ached at the sight. As they stood outside the restaurant, their breath rising in small clouds of warmth into the cold air, Jonathan said, "Thank you for tonight." Laura shook her head. "I should be thanking you." "No," he said softly. "This was the best Christmas Eve I've had in years." Anna reached up and hugged him before either adult could react. Her tiny arms wrapped around Jonathan's waistcoat, her cheeks squishing against the fabric. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Jonathan." His breath caught. Carefully, with something close to reverence, he hugged her back. "Merry Christmas, Anna." Laura stood nearby, watching them with an expression he couldn't quite define, something gentle, something hopeful, something like the fragile beginning of trust. Then she took Anna's hand, said goodnight, and walked down the snowy sidewalk until the crowd swallowed them. For a long moment after they disappeared, Jonathan remained exactly where he was, snow settling softly on his coat. He knew something extraordinary had just entered his life quietly, unexpectedly, beautifully. And he also knew he wasn't ready for the evening to end. For the first time in years, he had something to look forward to. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Jonathan didn't go home right away. Even after Laura and Anna disappeared into the snowy street, he stood outside the restaurant for a long moment, his breath curling into the cold air, his gloved hands resting atop the handle of his cane. The city around him buzzed with Christmas Eve energy, people racing to last-minute gatherings, the distant hum of carolers near Pike Place, the glow of street lamps reflecting off the snow, but none of it felt quite real to him. What felt real was the warmth that had briefly filled the space where loneliness had lived for far too long. He wasn't used to emotional echoes lingering inside him. Usually his nights ended the same way they began, numb, predictable, consumed by old memories and corporate obligations. But tonight something had cracked open in him, something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of anticipation, a strand of hope, a sense of connection so gentle, he almost doubted it could belong to him. The thought that Laura and Anna would be visiting his home tomorrow replayed in his mind with surprising force. He hadn't hosted anyone for Christmas, not even Lucas, since Eleanor died. The housekeepers decorated the penthouse each December, but it always felt staged, like a glossy magazine version of a holiday rather than a lived one. Trees trimmed but untouched, stockings hung but never filled, wreaths purchased but never admired. This year had been no different until now. Inside the warm back seat of the car, Jonathan removed his gloves and ran a hand slowly over the smooth leather. Lost in thought, he could still feel the pressure of Anna's small arms around him, the sincerity of her hug. Children didn't filter their affection. They gave it freely when they deemed someone worthy. The fact that she had approached him so confidently, so earnestly, struck him deeper than he let on. And Laura, her courage that night was quieter, but just as profound. She had stepped into a world that wasn't built for her, surrounded by polished surfaces and wealthy strangers, yet she carried herself with dignity and grace. She hadn't tried to impress him, she hadn't pretended to be someone she wasn't. That truthfulness felt rarer than any luxury Jonathan had ever purchased. When he arrived at his penthouse, the place felt different. The holiday lights glowed softly along the window frames, but instead of feeling decorative and distant, they seemed warmer, more inviting. As if the entire space had been waiting for something, for someone to break its long winter. He walked slowly through the foyer, the soft click of his cane echoing through the wide hall, and stopped in front of the grand piano. He hadn't touched it since Eleanor died. She had been the musician in their marriage, the one who filled the home with melodies that drifted from room to room like sunlight. Jonathan had always preferred listening to her rather than attempting to play himself. Now, as he rested his hand gently on the polished lid, he pictured Anna's face lighting up when he told her about the piano. Tomorrow she would be here, tiny fingers pressing gently on the keys with wonder. Tomorrow, this home would have sound again, not the hollow echo of an empty space, but the sound of life. He moved through the kitchen next. Everything was in perfect condition, flawless and untouched. But he realized he had nothing suitable to offer guests, not the kind of guests who deserved comfort, warmth, something that felt real. He made a call to his assistant, Margaret, even though the hour was late. She answered instantly, she always did. "Mr. Hale, do you need something?" "Yes," he said. "I'll need the kitchen stock by morning. Fresh pastries, fruit, decent coffee, and something suitable for a child." A pause. "A child, sir?" "Yes." Another pause. "Of course. I'll take care of it." He could practically hear her curiosity, but she was too professional to ask. After the call, Jonathan walked to the large window overlooking the sound. Snow drifted down in wisps, catching the glow of the city lights. His reflection stared back at him, older, more fragile than he liked to admit, but somehow more alive tonight than he had felt in a very long time. He thought about Laura again. The exhaustion in her eyes wasn't weakness, it was evidence of endurance. He knew the look because he had seen it in the mirror many times. She carried her life with resilience, not complaint, and she had built her world with her hands, literally shaping wood into restored beauty. That stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the universe or fate, or chance, or something he didn't usually believe in had nudged them toward him that night. If the diner hadn't run out of food, if the snow hadn't fallen just so, if the restaurant hadn't been full enough to cause hesitation, if Anna hadn't been the kind of child who listened to her own heart instead of her mother's caution, none of it would have happened. But it did, and the memory of Anna approaching him, tiny boots, determined stride, earnest eyes, kept replaying. She reminded him so much of Lucas when he was small, before bitterness built walls between them. Lucas had once been fearless too, drawn to people without hesitation. But Jonathan had spent too many years modeling distance, discipline, and ambition at any cost. He often wondered whether Lucas had learned to pull away, because he watched his father do it first. The H of that thought settled briefly in his chest. Jonathan closed the curtains halfway, dimmed the lights, and made his way back to the living area. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a tomorrow that didn't look identical to the day before it. He imagined the sound of small footsteps on the polished floors, laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, the rustle of drawing paper, the excited chatter of a child who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. He imagined Laura's careful but curious gaze, her quiet strength filling the space not with grandeur, but with warmth. There was something grounding about her presence, something real. And Jonathan, a man who had spent decades surrounded by people who only approached him for opportunity or influence, felt the rare comfort of being seen not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but simply as a man. Before heading to his bedroom, he stopped at the hall closet, the one where he kept Eleanor's things stored neatly in boxes he rarely allowed himself to open. His hand hovered for a moment, then withdrew. Not tonight. Some memories were too tender to disturb so soon, but he felt something shift anyway. The past no longer felt like a closed door. It felt like a room he could revisit with new understanding, perhaps even with new people. That thought alone carried more hope than he'd felt in years. When he finally lay down, the snow was still falling outside. Instead of the heavy, restless thoughts that usually crowded his mind, a quiet sense of anticipation settled over him. The last thing he remembered before sleep found him was the image of a lavender coat, a homemade Christmas card, and the simple words that had cracked him open more than anything else ever could. Nobody should be alone on Christmas. And tomorrow, for the first time in years, he wouldn't be. Laura didn't sleep much that night. After leaving the restaurant, she and Anna walked the 8 blocks back to their apartment, the snow settling on their coats and hats as Anna chattered breathlessly about everything, about the fancy lights in the restaurant, about the desserts they didn't have room for, about the piano she couldn't wait to touch, and most of all about Mither, Jonathan, whom she spoke of as though he were a character straight out of a Christmas storybook. Laura listened with half her attention. The other half was tangled in thoughts she couldn't untangle no matter how she tried. Something about the evening had felt surreal, rare, undeserved, extraordinary. She kept replaying the moment Anne wandered toward Jonathan's table. The way the old man's expression softened the second he looked at her daughter. The gentle patience he showed, the sincerity in his voice, the way he seemed grateful, not just polite to have company. And then there was the revelation about who he was. She'd known the name Hale her entire life. Anyone raised around Seattle did. Hale Properties was everywhere: downtown skyscrapers, renovated historic buildings, commercial developments, even the waterfront. Laura had seen construction crews wearing the Hale logo. She'd seen the marble lobbies with Hale's name etched in steel. She had passed the Hale corporate tower more times than she could count. But never, not in any scenario she imagined, had she pictured herself sitting across from the man who built it all, eating dinner with him while her daughter drew pictures of the three of them. As Anna fell asleep the second her head hit the pillow, Laura stayed awake on the couch, staring at the small apartment she'd worked so hard to maintain. The living room doubled as her workspace: piles of sandpaper, jars of varnish, scattered tools she couldn't afford to replace, even though many were past their prime. A half-finished restoration project sat on the coffee table, an old oak chair with cracked joints she'd promised to fix for Mrs. Wilson upstairs. Nothing in the apartment looked like the world Jonathan lived in. But what struck her wasn't the difference in luxury, it was the question of why a man like that had wanted them at his table, why he had asked them to visit his home, why he had looked at her with something so genuine it made her chest tighten. Laura wasn't Novi. Life had trained her to be wary. People with money often had motives, some transparent, some disguised behind charity, like kindness. But Jonathan had not looked at her like a project. He had looked at her like someone who mattered in that moment, someone whose presence gave him something he hadn't had in a long time. She rarely trusted easily, but she hadn't sensed judgment in him, not once. It wasn't the feeling of being assessed. It was the feeling of being seen. And that frightened her more than any wealthy stranger ever could. In the morning, Anna was the one who dragged Laura out of bed, bouncing with excitement. "We re-seeing the piano today. And Mr. Jonathan! And his house! Do you think he has cookies?" "I think he has cookies." Laura smiled despite her exhaustion. "We were just visiting for a little while, remember? We need to be respectful." "I can be respectful," Anna insisted, already wearing mismatched socks. "But what if his house is huge? Like huge? It probably is," Laura muttered under her breath. "Can we bring him something?" Anna asked. Like a thank you present." Laura paused mid-step. She hadn't thought of that. But Anna's instinct was right. "We can't go empty-handed," the little girl insisted, her tone solemn, as though this were a sacred rule. Laura considered their options. They had no money for fancy gifts. But gifts didn't have to be expensive. "How about cookies?" Lara suggested. "Homemade is usually better than store-bought anyway." Anna gasped dramatically. "We can make the chocolate chip ones." Laura nodded. And so the two of them spent the morning mixing flour, sugar, and chocolate chips in a bowl that was slightly dented from years of use. The apartment filled with the warm, sweet smell of baking. Anna shaped the cookies with her tiny hands, uneven in size but full of heart. When they cooled, she wrapped them in the nicest paper. They had a piece of silver tissue paper Laura had saved from a Christmas present years ago, because she never wasted anything reusable. Laura dressed carefully. She didn't own anything elegant, so she chose a clean cream sweater and dark jeans with no paint stains. She tied her hair in a neat braid and put on the same boots she wore every day. She glanced at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and reminded herself not to overthink things. This was just a thank you visit. Nothing more. But her hands still shook a little when she locked the apartment door behind them. Jonathan, meanwhile, had been pacing his living room since 8 that morning. He tried not to look eager, but the truth was impossible to deny. He'd woken earlier than usual, showered, and even put on a soft charcoal sweater instead of his typical tailored suit. He wanted to appear welcoming, casual, approachable, words no one had ever used to describe him, not in decades. Margaret had already delivered pastries, fresh fruit, artisan hot chocolate mix, and enough coffee beans to caffeinate an entire construction crew. Jonathan spent too long arranging everything neatly on the kitchen island, then rearranging it. Then deciding it looked ridiculous and rearranging it again. At one point, he caught his reflection in the window, an old man fussing over pastries, and shook his head with a quiet, self-conscious smile. But every few minutes he found himself checking the elevator display, listening for the distant chime that signaled someone had arrived. And then it happened, a soft ding, the elevator doors opening, small footsteps. Jonathan's heart lifted unexpectedly. He wasn't sure when the last time was that he'd felt anticipation that wasn't tied to business, but it had been years, decades even. He moved to the foyer, gripping his cane a little tighter than necessary. The doorbell rang. He didn't realize he was smiling until he opened the door. Anna stood front and center, proudly holding the bundle of cookies wrapped in silver paper. "We made these for you," she blurted before Laura could say anything. Laura flushed. "I hope that's all right," she insisted. Jonathan felt warmth gather in his chest. "It's perfect," he said. "Really perfect." His gaze shifted to Laura. She looked nervous, but her eyes softened when he stepped aside to welcome them in. "Come in, please." As they entered the penthouse, Anna gasped so loudly it echoed. "Mom, it is huge." Jonathan laughed, the sound echoing into the vast open living space. For a moment, he forgot about the cane, the aches in his legs, the widowhood, the corporate battles, the years spent alone. All he saw was a little girl in a lavender jacket running toward the grand piano, with sparkling eyes, and her mother standing beside him. Beautiful in a simple, quiet way, trying to take in a world so different from her own. Jonathan realized something, that not with shock but with clarity. He didn't want this to be a one-time visit. He wanted this presence in his home. This laughter, this warmth, this small, unexpected piece of life he thought he had lost forever. Tomorrow he would make an offer to Laura that would change everything. But for now, he simply allowed himself the joy of watching them transform his home into something it hadn't been in years, a place where life existed. Jonathan led Laura and Anna into the living room as though he were unveiling a secret part of himself he had forgotten existed. The penthouse, usually quiet, polished, and hollow, felt unexpectedly alive with their presence. Anna rushed toward the grand piano the moment she spotted it, stopping just inches away as if approaching something sacred. She extended one hand with dramatic caution, pausing to look back at Jonathan. "Can I touch it?" she asked with breathless excitement. "You may," Jonathan said, smiling warmly. "Just be gentle." Anna nodded fiercely, as if accepting a mission, and pressed a single key. The note rang out pure and bright, filling the room with a sound the home hadn't heard in years. She pressed another, then another, quickly abandoning caution and dancing her fingers across the keys in a chaotic but joyful melody. Jonathan watched her with a softness he didn't try to hide. Her laughter, her delight, the glow in her eyes, these things pulled him back into memories of when Lucas had been small, when the piano had been a source of family music on quiet Sunday afternoons. Back when life had felt fuller, warmer, before time scattered everything in directions he no longer understood. Laura, standing a few steps behind him, watched Anna with an expression that blended pride, love, and something like relief. It was the look of a mother who didn't often get to see her child experience things as bright as this. Jonathan turned to her slowly. "She has a beautiful spirit," he said quietly. Laura smiled. "She does. She keeps me going on the days when I think I can't put one foot in front of the other." "She reminds me of someone," Jonathan replied, and though he didn't name Lucas aloud, the memory flickered in his eyes. Laura didn't pry, but she saw it. He guided her to the sitting area, where the morning light streamed through floor to ceiling windows, casting a golden glow over the modern furniture and curated art pieces. The room was immaculate, but it felt warmer than usual today, infused with a presence he hadn't realized he missed this deeply. "Please," he said, gesturing to the sofa, "make yourself comfortable." Laura sat carefully, as if afraid she might break something expensive. She tucked her hands into her lap and straightened her posture, trying not to appear overwhelmed, even though the penthouse could have fit her entire apartment 3 times over. Jonathan sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the sincerity radiating from him. Before he could speak further, Anna dashed back toward them, her small boots tapping loudly across the hardwood floor. "Mom, Mr. Jonathan has a piano." "A real one? I see," Laura said, her voice amused even as she attempted to maintain parental composure. "Did you thank him for letting you play it?" Anna spun toward Jonathan. "Thank you. I will take good care of it while I'm here." "I believe you," Jonathan said warmly. He motioned toward the kitchen. "Would you two like something to drink? I have pastries, hot chocolate, coffee, probably too much of everything." Laura shook her head lightly. "You didn't need to go through any trouble. We weren't expecting anything." "It was no trouble," Jonathan replied. And to his surprise, it wasn't. He wanted to do it. He wanted them there. As Anna returned to the piano, tapping out what she insisted was a song about snowflakes, Jonathan finally turned more fully toward Laura. The air shifted between them, not with tension but with meaning. "Laura," he began, choosing his words with care, "I asked you here today for more than coffee and pastries." Laura straightened, her eyes sharpening with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "I thought you might," she said honestly. It didn't seem like a casual invitation. Jonathan appreciated her forthrightness. He took a slow breath before continuing. "Last night you told me about your work restoring furniture, bringing old things back to life." Laura exhaled softly, watching him closely. "I've spent decades in development," Jonathan continued, "building new towers, new complexes, new districts. But as I've gotten older, I've realized something I ignored for a very long time. New buildings don't mean anything if we erase the ones that hold history." Laura's eyebrows lifted. She hadn't expected the conversation to move in that direction. "There's a project," Jonathan said, leaning forward slightly. "A building from 1895 that my company owns. We haven't known what to do with it for years. Every proposal has been the same: gut it, modernize it, erase its identity. I've rejected all of them." Laura nodded slowly, unsure where he was going. "I saw something in you last night," Jonathan went on. "Not charity, not obligation, potential, craftsmanship, a reverence for what came before, and a fire I haven't seen in a long time." She swallowed, stunned by the intensity behind his voice. Jonathan, I'm just a carpenter. No, he said firmly. You re an artist who works with wood, and someone with a mind for restoration. True restoration is exactly what I've been searching for. She blinked, her breath catching. Are you offering me a job? I am, Jonathan said. Something far larger than any job you've had before. I want you to lead a new division at Hale Properties. A division focused on preserving and restoring the historic structures in this city that everyone else has given up on. Laura stared at him, unable to form words. Jonathan continued gently, I know you don't have a degree. I know you've been told that disqualifies you. But I disagree. You have the skill, the vision, and the heart for the work I need done. Laura finally spoke, her voice unsteady. Jonathan, this is too much. You don't even know me. I know enough, he said. I know what I saw in your portfolio last night after you left. I asked my assistant to gather examples of your previous work, and what I saw was brilliant, not just technically good, inspired. She brought a hand to her chest, overwhelmed. But I'm just one person. I've never supervised anyone. I've never run projects for big companies, and I have Anna. My schedule is complicated. I'm aware, he said, and none of that disqualifies you. If anything, it makes you stronger. His voice softened. Laura, you've been fighting alone for too long. Let someone fight for you for once. Her eyes glistened. Why me? Jonathan glanced toward Anna, who was now trying to play the piano with one hand while dancing in place. His smile was tender. Because your daughter reminded me what matters. And you reminded me what people can become when someone finally gives them a chance. He turned back to her. I want to give you that chance. Laura looked down, her throat tight. She had spent years pushing boulders uphill, forced to be self-reliant in ways that exhausted her to the bone. No one had ever stepped in beside her, not employers, not friends, not family. And now here was a man with unimaginable power offering her something she had always thought was out of reach. Something that could change everything. Before she could answer, Anna sprinted toward them again. Mom, I made up another song. Can we stay forever? Jonathan laughed, the sound bright and genuine. Forever might be a stretch, he said, but how about a little while longer? Laura looked at Jonathan, really looked at him, and understood that this was not a random act of kindness. It was a turning point, a door opening that she had never expected to see. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Jonathan, this is a lot. I need time to think. Jonathan nodded. Of course, take all the time you need. But as he met her gaze, he also knew, just as she did, that their lives had already begun to shift. And neither of them would ever be the same again. Laura didn't give Jonathan an immediate answer that morning, and he didn't expect one. After she and Anna finally left the penthouse, Anna reluctantly, clutching the last cookie she'd saved for the road, Jonathan remained in the foyer long after the elevator doors closed. Listening to their voices fade down the hallway, there was a strange fullness in his chest again, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years. It wasn't just hope, it was purpose. A renewed sense of direction he'd thought he'd buried with Eleanor and the remnants of his old life. He stood there for an entire minute before he forced himself to turn away. He wasn't a man prone to daydreaming or impulsive emotion. His entire career had been built on discipline and structure. But Laura Bennett had unsettled something deep inside him. Not romantically, no, it was something more elemental. A recognition. She had the same fire he once had, back when he was just a young builder with more willpower than resources, and long before the world began calling him Meter Hale instead of Jonathan. Meanwhile, Laura and Anna walked the long hallway toward the elevator in near silence, not tense silence, but thoughtful silence, the kind that followed life-changing conversations. Anna glanced up repeatedly, waiting for her mother to speak first. When they finally reached the street, the cold air wrapped around them, and Laura drew her coat tighter, exhaling slowly. She didn't know what to say. The job Jonathan described was nothing like the work she did in her cramped apartment workshop. It was bigger, more complex, and far beyond what she believed someone like her would ever be offered. She had no degree, no corporate experience, no network, just raw skill, stubborn grit, and a desire to build a stable life for her daughter. And yet Jonathan had looked at her as though he saw more than the surface. More than her worn boots, her calloused hands, her thrift store coat. He had seen potential, and not just potential, value. As they waited for the bus, Anna tugged at her sleeve. Mom, she said softly, you liked him. Lara blinked. What do you mean? You talked to him like you trusted him, Anna replied matter-of-factly. You never talk like that to grown-ups you don't trust. Laura swallowed. It was true. She had spoken to Jonathan openly, even though she barely knew him, and he had listened not with polite patience but with genuine interest. That alone was rare. Back in the penthouse, Jonathan made his way to his office, an impeccably arranged room of dark wood shelves, antique maps, and architectural models he'd collected over decades. But today the space felt different. It felt too still, too polished, too disconnected from what he was beginning to envision for the future of the company. He sat at his desk, opened the folder Margaret had prepared about the 1895 building, and studied the photographs again. Crumbling staircases, rotted beams, stained glass windows cracked through the center, the once grand façade now tired and faded. Most developers would have demolished it years ago. But something about the place had always felt sacred to him. He'd never found the right hands to restore it. Not until last night. He pressed the intercom. Margaret, could you step in? His assistant entered moments later, impeccably dressed, composed as always. Yes, Hale, I want you to prepare a formal outline, Jonathan said. A new division within the company. Preservation and historic restoration. I want the framework by the end of the week. Margaret blinked, taken aback. That's a major expansion. Has the board approved this? Not yet, Jonathan replied. I'll handle them. And who exactly will be leading this division? She asked carefully. I will inform the board when necessary, Jonathan said, his tone decisive. Margaret nodded, though confusion lingered in her eyes. After she left, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, feeling a push of determination he hadn't felt in a long time. He envisioned Laura on a construction site, overseeing crews, uncovering the building's history layer by layer. He pictured her teaching apprentices the old woodworking methods her father had passed down. He imagined the building reborn under her direction, and it felt right. Across town, Laura set Anna up with crayons and paper, then sank onto the couch, pressing her palms over her face. She was overwhelmed not by fear but by possibility. The kind she never allowed herself to consider. A director-level position at one of the most powerful companies on the West Coast. It didn't feel real. And more than that, she worried it wasn't meant for her. Jonathan might have been moved by kindness and admiration, but companies ran on more than sentiment. What if she failed? What if she walked into that historic building and froze? What if she made one wrong decision and ruined everything? And yes, she trusted Jonathan more than she expected, but trust didn't erase the life she had to protect. She had responsibilities, bills, a child, no safety net. That night, after Anna fell asleep, Laura sat at her small kitchen table, the chair creaking beneath her. She opened the notebook where she tracked her monthly expenses, rent overdue, utilities climbing, medical debt from Anna's flu last year still unpaid, a half-finished client job she needed to complete by Friday for cash. And then she pictured the building Jonathan had described. The potential, the purpose, the chance. She wanted it. She wanted it in a way that scared her. Jonathan, on the other side of the city, stared out the window of his penthouse again, the same way he had the night before. But tonight his thoughts weren't heavy. They were focused, driven. He thought of Laura's hands, the steady, practiced movements of someone who knew wood like others knew numbers or language. He thought of her resilience. And he thought of Anna, who had wandered into his loneliness and lit it up in a way he didn't know he needed. By noon the next day, Jonathan opened his phone and typed a message to Laura 3 times before erasing it. He wasn't nervous. He simply didn't want to pressure her. Instead, he wrote it, take all the time you need. I believe in you. He hesitated, then sent it. Laura read the message while sanding the leg of the oak chair. Her breath hitched, not because of the offer, but because of the last 4 words. No one had ever said them to her. Not teachers, not employers, not even her late husband, not explicitly. The truth settled deep inside her, warm and disarming. For the rest of the day, her hands worked more steadily. Her mind wandered more boldly. She didn't decide immediately, but she felt the decision building quietly like a tide rising. That evening, when Anna asked if they could visit Jonathan again soon, Laura almost told her no. But instead she said maybe. We'll see. And for the first time, she meant it without hesitation. At the same moment across town, Jonathan received a notification on his phone, a photograph from the security system of the old 1895 building. The lights had flickered on automatically as one of the maintenance staff passed through the lobby. Dust hung in the air. The stained glass glowed faintly in the low light. Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest. He whispered a promise into the quiet room. "I think we found the person who can save you." And deep down, he knew he wasn't talking only about the building. Over the next week, the offer Jonathan had extended began to ripple through the edges of both their lives. Even though neither spoke of it directly, Laura found herself waking up earlier, her mind wrestling with possibilities before her feet even touched the floor. She carried the weight of Jonathan's words everywhere she went, into the workshop, into the grocery store, into the quiet evenings when she tucked Anna into bed and sat alone afterward with a cup of cheap coffee cooling between her palms. The offer lingered like a new doorway in her mind, one she wanted to open but feared stepping through. She knew that accepting it would uproot everything she knew. It wasn't just a job, it was a leap into a world where she wasn't sure she belonged. Yet as days passed, she kept circling back to what Jonathan believed she could do it, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely saw someone capable. And though she tried to resist the idea, she couldn't shake the truth that she had been overlooked for years by people who didn't bother to really look at her work. But Jonathan had looked, seen, listened. That alone carried a weight she couldn't ignore. By midweek, Jonathan's world was shifting too, though in ways he tried to contain. In meetings with his executives, he found himself distracted, his mind wandering toward the rusted beams and weathered brick of the 1895 building he now felt determined to save. During one board meeting, he surprised everyone by announcing a temporary freeze on all redevelopment proposals for historical properties. The board exchanged looks, half impressed, half skeptical. Jonathan's decisions usually came after months of strategic analysis. This one came like an instinctive command. Some questioned it, others admired it. But none dared challenge him directly. He spent his afternoons reviewing old architectural plans and reading through every inspection report on the historic building. And though he was still a man of reason, he couldn't deny that something had changed inside him. The work felt meaningful again. Purposeful, not simply profitable. For the first time in a long time, he was excited to build something not forward but backward, to restore instead of demolish, to revive instead of replace. Several times he started to text Laura, asking if she had made a decision, but each time he stopped himself. Pressure would only push her away. So he waited, something he rarely did in business but found himself willing to do for her. Laura, meanwhile, forced herself to finish her small restoration jobs with meticulous care, as though proving her worth to herself. She photographed each finished piece, not for social media or clients, but to remind herself she was capable of more than survival work. She was capable of craft. One night, while sanding the armrest of a century-old rocking chair, she paused and whispered to herself, "Maybe he's right." It was the first time she acknowledged it aloud. That Saturday morning, Laura packed a small bag of tools, more out of habit than purpose. "Where are we going?" Anna asked, eating cereal at the table. Laura hesitated. "Just somewhere I need to look at," she said. But in truth, she knew exactly where they were going. She had seen the address Jonathan mentioned on the paperwork he showed her, the old 1895 building, the heart of the offer. When they arrived at the site, the structure towered above them, weathered and beautiful even in its decay. The brick facade was faded, the ornate stonework chipped by time, the tall arched windows clouded by years of dust. A temporary chain link fence circled the perimeter, but the gate stood open, as though inviting them inside. Anna pressed her forehead to the fence. "It looks like a castle," she whispered. Laura stepped closer, her eyes scanning the building with the instinct of someone who understood wood, weight, and age. Even from the outside, she could tell where beams had rotted, where water had seeped, where the structure sagged under its own history. But she could also see potential lines of craftsmanship hidden beneath the wear, engravings almost erased by time, details no modern architect could replicate. "Mom," Anna said softly, "you like it?" Laura didn't answer at first. Her chest tightened with a mixture of awe and responsibility. She could feel the building speaking to her in its own quiet way, the way old things always did, when someone truly paid attention. This was no ordinary restoration job. It was a resurrection. She wasn't supposed to go inside, but the door, propped open for maintenance earlier that week, creaked invitingly. After a moment of hesitation, she stepped through the doorway, Anna close behind. The interior smelled of dust and forgotten years. Sunlight filtered through cracked stained glass, casting fractured colors across the floor. Wooden balustrades, though splintered, still held echoes of old elegance. Hand-carved molding stretched along the walls, faded but resolute. Even the damaged floorboards held stories. A strange calm washed over her. She walked slowly through the lobby, touching the worn banister, running her fingertips along the rough texture of the walls. She wasn't imagining it, her hands knew exactly what needed to be done. She could rebuild this. She could bring it back. Anna tiptoed beside her, her eyes wide. "Mom, are you gonna fix this whole place?" Anna asked. Lara didn't answer for a long moment. Then, in a voice almost carried by instinct rather than decision, she whispered, "Maybe I am." Across the city, Jonathan was reviewing a proposal when his phone buzzed. A photo appeared on his screen. Lara had sent it. A single image of her hand resting on the carved wooden banister inside the building. That was all. No message, no explanation. But Jonathan understood instantly. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was something even more important. She was imagining herself there. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and headed out the door. When he arrived 20 minutes later, he found Laura standing in the center of the lobby, her head tilted back as she studied the ceiling. Anna sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, drawing the building in crayon. Jonathan didn't speak at first. He simply watched Laura absorb the space, quiet, thoughtful, focused. She finally turned to him, a mixture of wonder and apprehension in her eyes. "You brought her here," Jonathan said softly. "I had to see it," Laura replied. "In person and?" Jonathan asked quietly, his voice steady but expectant. Laura took a long breath. "This building is incredible. Broken, but incredible." She looked at him with something like conviction beginning to form. "If I take this job," she said slowly, "I'm not taking it halfway. I'm not doing it as some corporate formality. If I do this, I need full freedom to restore this place properly. No shortcuts. No cost-cutting that'll destroy the history. No board breathing down my neck." Jonathan stepped closer, nodding without hesitation. "You'll have full authority, total creative control." Laura's eyes softened as she processed his certainty. "And one more thing," she said, her voice firm though her hands trembled slightly. "If I do this, I want to bring people with me. People like me. Craftsmen who never get a chance because they don't fit corporate molds. People who understand restoration the way my father did." Jonathan's chest warmed with admiration. "Then build your team," he said. "Whoever you want. I trust your judgment." Laura looked away for a moment, overwhelmed. Not by the size of the opportunity, but by the size of the faith he placed in her. Anna tugged her sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, "say yes." The old building creaked faintly as if urging the same. Laura looked back at Jonathan, and in that moment, the answer she'd been wrestling with all week finally settled inside her. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm ready." Jonathan's breath left him in something close to relief, something close to joy, and as light from the cracked windows fell across all three of them, he felt the shift clearly. This was the beginning of something bigger than restoration, bigger than the building itself. It was the beginning of rebuilding lives. The official announcement of Laura's position did not unfold quietly. Jonathan had expected resistance from his board, but even he underestimated just how forcefully his senior executives would push back. The following Monday morning, the boardroom on the 35th floor of Hale Tower filled with murmurs, sharp whispers, and the rustling of expensive suits as the leadership team gathered. The long glass table reflected their tense expressions, and as Jonathan entered with his usual calm authority, the room fell into an uneasy hush. He had been in countless meetings over the years where he commanded instant respect. But this one felt different, not because he doubted himself, but because he was about to challenge a system he himself had built. He took his seat at the head of the table, folding his hands, scanning the room. Margaret stood at his right, a stack of folders ready. The executives waited. Some leaned back with arms crossed. Others tapped their pens impatiently, all bracing for the unexpected shift Jonathan had hinted at the previous week. "Thank you all for coming," Jonathan began, his voice steady. "I want to present a strategic shift that will impact our company going forward." Immediately the tension thickened. Hale Properties didn't do shifts. It grew, expanded, acquired, and dominated, but it did not shift. The chief financial officer, a lean man with a permanent air of skepticism, leaned forward. "This about your new freeze on redevelopment plans. Because investors have questions, Jonathan." "It's about something bigger," Jonathan said, unbothered. We've spent decades building new. Now we will expand our mission to preserving the old. A few brows rose, a couple of snorts escaped. I am establishing a historic restoration division. Effective immediately. Silence, then chaos. A restoration division at what cost? We're not a heritage nonprofit. This is not our business model, Jonathan. Who is even qualified to run such a division? Jonathan let the voices swell before slowly raising a hand. The room fell quiet again, though reluctantly. I've already chosen the new director, he said. She has my full confidence. She echoed the head of operations. Who exactly is she? Jonathan didn't flinch. Laura Bennett. Confusion rippled across the room. Blank stares, furrowed brows. Then the chief strategist spoke, voice laced with controlled irritation. Forgive me, Jonathan, but who is Laura Bennett? A master carpenter, Jonathan said simply. Specialized in restoration. Skilled, talented visionary, a carpenter. The word fell with derision. Without a degree, someone muttered. Another scoffed, this is absurd. Jonathan's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in defense of someone he believed in more than these men and women realized. Your concerns are noted, he said coolly, but my decision stands. Ms. Bennett will lead restoration efforts on the 1895 Hale building. The CFO laughed under his breath. She doesn't have the qualifications, no formal education, no project management background, no executive experience. What she has, Jonathan replied evenly, is mastery, a deep understanding of old world craftsmanship, an eye for preservation, and more passion than most people in this room have shown in years. The room erupted again, now in sharper tones. Some argued publicly, others whispered to each other with increasing hostility, and beneath all of it was something Jonathan recognized instantly: class prejudice. Raw and unfiltered. They didn't object to the division. They objected to Laura, a woman who didn't have a prestigious degree, someone who came from the working class, someone who didn't fit into the polished narrative of their corporate world. Jonathan raised his hand once more. This time his voice was cold steel enough. The room quieted. His gaze swept across each face, expression firm but controlled. This company was built on risk-taking, on believing in what others overlooked. I was once dismissed for not having the right credentials. I will not allow the same small-mindedness to dictate our future. The coup sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Jonathan, the board will not approve this. She lacks every traditional metric we use for leadership roles. Jonathan leaned forward, his tone sharp as glass. Then we change the metrics. Margaret glanced at him, impressed despite her composed demeanor. A murmur swept the table, shock, maybe admiration, mostly disbelief. Jonathan continued, if you cannot trust my judgment after 40 years of proven leadership, then perhaps you should reconsider your place at this table. The threat wasn't subtle, and it silenced the room completely. After several long seconds, the CFO exhaled reluctantly. If this is truly your decision, then the board will review her on a provisional basis. Her work will speak for itself, Jonathan replied, and it will speak loudly. He stood, signaling the meeting was over. Executives slowly filed out, some nodding stiffly, others glaring, a few already texting colleagues, undoubtedly spreading their displeasure. When the room was nearly empty, the coup approached him privately. Jonathan, he said carefully, this woman, is she important to you? Jonathan met his gaze evenly. Her work is important to this company, he replied. The coup didn't look convinced. And to you? Jonathan answered with measured clarity. She represents something this company has lost. Vision. And he meant it. When he was finally alone, Jonathan allowed his shoulders to drop, just slightly. Not out of defeat, but out of the weight of knowing he was defending more than a new department. He was defending someone he believed deserved a chance. The same chance no one had given him decades ago. Meanwhile, Laura had no idea how fiercely Jonathan was fighting for her behind corporate walls. That morning, she was sanding a wooden frame for a client when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Jonathan. Board meeting finished. Progress made. I'll update you soon. She read it twice, her heart skipping. Not because she felt pressure, but because she realized he was carrying burdens on her behalf that she had never asked for. And somehow, that made her want to live up to the faith he placed in her even more. Later that afternoon, Jonathan visited the 1895 building alone. He walked through the empty halls, imagining them filled with life again. Laura's vision guiding the restoration. Craftsmen learning under her lead. The city rediscovering its history. As he stood beneath the cracked stained glass, he murmured almost to himself, they don't see what I see. But they will. And miles away, Laura stood on her apartment balcony, wiping varnish from her fingers, watching the Seattle skyline shimmer against the evening snow. Somewhere among those glowing towers was a man fighting battles she had never asked him to fight. A man who believed she could change an entire building, and maybe even change him, too. By the time night fell, both of them felt the shift. The decision had been made. The challenge had begun. And the world around them was about to change, whether the board approved or not. The first official day of the restoration project began long before the sun rose over Seattle. A soft mist hovered above the streets, clinging to the cold morning air, and the sky glowed a pale gray as if the daylight itself was reluctant to appear. Laura arrived earlier, in fact, than anyone expected. She stood outside the historic building with her tool bag slung over her shoulder, her breath forming small clouds in front of her, her heart thudded with equal parts adrenaline and nerves. This wasn't just another job. This was the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one that felt impossibly heavy and impossibly hopeful at the same time. She stepped through the entrance as though entering sacred ground. The building's interior, still dark and silent, felt like a slumbering giant waiting to wake. Her boots echoed across the dusty lobby as she traced her fingers over carvings and cracked moldings. Even after her earlier visit, the place still stunned her. She could feel the history in every curve, every flaw, every creaking board. "We were gonna bring you back," she whispered, almost instinctively, piece by piece. She didn't expect an answer, but something in the room felt alive nonetheless. By 6:30 a.m., the first members of her new team began to arrive. Contractors, electricians, and a few craftsmen Jonathan had arranged on short notice. Laura recognized most of them as people who had been overlooked by mainstream companies, older carpenters with decades of experience. Apprentices who had raw skill but no formal background. Tradespeople who cared deeply about their work but didn't fit neatly into modern corporate molds. Jonathan had listened when she said she wanted people like her. And he delivered. They gathered awkwardly in the lobby as she stepped forward, drawing in a breath as she faced them. Public speaking had never come naturally to her, but today she needed to lead. She needed to be the person Jonathan believed she was. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Thank you for being here. This building," she paused, searching for the right words. "This building matters. Not just because it's old, but because it was built with care, by hands that believed in craftsmanship. And we here to honor that. We not gutting this place. We bringing it back. That means patience, attention to detail, and respect for the original work." A few men nodded. One older carpenter gave a small smile of approval. That alone loosened something in her chest. "This won't be fast," she continued, "and it won't be easy. But I promise you this: no one is here because they look good on paper. You here because you good at what you do. And I'm proud to work with you." For a moment there was silence, then one man clapped, then another, and soon the entire group joined in. Not loud, not dramatic, but full of genuine respect. Laura felt her throat tighten, but she steadied herself. "Let's get started," she said. Meanwhile, Jonathan was on the 35th floor of Hale Tower, trying to pay attention to a budget review meeting he couldn't care less about. His mind was entirely elsewhere. He kept glancing at the time, imagining Laura in her boots and tool belt, walking through the building with purpose. When the coup presented a chart about quarterly revenue projections, Jonathan realized he hadn't heard a word. "I need a 15-minute break," he interrupted abruptly. The executives blinked at him in surprise, but he didn't wait for their approval. He stepped out, shut the boardroom door, and leaned lightly on his cane, exhaling. He wasn't worried about Laura. He trusted her completely. He just wanted to see how things were going. Wanted to be near her excitement, her focus, the renewal she carried with her. He texted her, "Thinking of you. Everything going smoothly." Laura didn't see the message right away. She was busy standing on a ladder, examining a crumbling section of the ceiling with intense concentration. When she finally checked her phone, she smiled despite herself. She typed back, "So far so good. Team is strong. Building is breathtaking." Jonathan read the message twice, warmth rising in him. "I'll stop by later," he wrote. At the site, work began in earnest. Dust filled the air as old drywall was tested for safety. Electricians examined the outdated wiring. Laura coordinated everything with surprising natural authority, delegating, inspecting, and sketching measurements in her notebook. Discussing structural integrity with the foreman, She was everywhere at once, moving with purpose, her confidence growing with each decision she made. At one point, a young apprentice approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Bennett." She looked up from the blueprint she was reviewing. "Call me Laura," she said. "Right, Laura. I was just wondering if you want me to start on the stair railing or the west wall molding." She considered. "The railing, it's more fragile. We need to stabilize it before anyone gets hurt." "Got it," he said, nodding as he hurried off. Laura felt a small surge of pride. She was directing a team, a real team. And they were listening. By noon, Jonathan arrived. He didn't announce himself, he just slipped through the doors quietly, though not quietly enough to avoid attracting attention. One worker nudged another, a third straightened up immediately. Everyone recognized him. Laura was on the scaffolding, brushing years of grime from an ornate molding. She turned at the sound of murmuring and spotted him below. She climbed down quickly, brushing dust from her hands. "Jonathan," she said, a bit breathless from the height. "You didn't have to come." "I wanted to," he said simply, eyes traveling across the room in admiration. "It's incredible what you've done already." "We only just started," she said, laughing lightly. "And it's going to take months." "I know," he said. "But the energy is different. I can feel it. This place is waking up." Laura looked at him, surprised by how accurately he captured what she felt. Jonathan stayed for over an hour, not giving orders, not inspecting like a CO, but observing like someone who was witnessing something deeply personal unfold. At one point, Laura showed him a piece of original molding she'd removed for restoration, explaining how she would reinforce it without altering the craftsmanship. Jonathan listened intently, fascinated by her knowledge. "You know," he said, "I've led thousands of projects, but I've never seen anyone talk about a building the way you do. I just respect it." She replied with a shy shrug. "Old things are worth saving. People too," Jonathan said quietly, and when she met his gaze, there was something unspoken between them, gentle, warm, undeniable. Later that afternoon, after Jonathan returned to his tower, the team uncovered a hidden section of original tiling beneath the rotted floorboards. Laura knelt beside it, breath-catching. It was a mosaic, intricate, colorful, completely unique. A piece of history no one even knew was there. She snapped a photo immediately and sent it to Jonathan. He replied within seconds, "Beautiful. Just like you said, this building has stories left." She typed back, "Then let's bring them all out." And Jonathan wrote it together. Laura stared at that word for a long moment. Together. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was real. It was partnership, trust, connection. Something her life had been missing for years. And as she stood in the heart of the dusty old building, surrounded by a team that believed in her, Laura realized something powerful. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't rebuilding alone. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of progress, exhaustion, discovery, and slow but undeniable transformation, both for the building and for the people working inside it. By the end of the first month, the once slumbering structure had begun to hum with life. Tools clattered, sandpaper rasped, generators buzzed, ladders creaked, voices filled the halls. And though dust covered everything from the staircases to the light fixtures, there was an unmistakable feeling in the air that something beautiful was beginning to take shape. Jonathan visited often, more often than protocol or necessity required. Sometimes he stayed only 10 minutes, sometimes an entire afternoon, leaning carefully on his cane as he observed the restoration work with a reverence he rarely showed in corporate settings. But the visits were never about oversight. They were about Laura. He was drawn to her focus, her passion, the way her hands moved with precision and tenderness when she worked. He watched her communicate with her team, clear, respectful, confident, and each day he saw her shoulders sit a little straighter, her voice grow a little more sure, her presence fill the room with a quiet authority that couldn't be taught in any classroom or boardroom. The team admired her. At first, they were surprised, unsure how someone who didn't come from the corporate world could lead such a major project. But Laura proved herself quickly. When she climbed scaffolding to inspect ceiling beams that others hesitated to touch, they saw her courage. When she worked alongside them sanding intricate moldings, they saw her dedication. When she sketched out detailed restoration plans with a pencil she kept tucked behind her ear, they saw her expertise. And when she really listened to their input, they saw her respect. Soon the skepticism faded. She was no longer the carpenter Jonathan hired. She became the boss, and they said it with admiration. One chilly Tuesday morning, while Laura was examining structural problems in the east corridor, the building's generator unexpectedly shut off. Lights flickered, then died entirely, plunging the space into near darkness. A few workers let out startled curses. Anna, who had accompanied Laura that day because school was closed for a teacher workday, grabbed her mother's sleeve tightly. "It's okay," Laura said, kneeling to reassure her. "Just a power issue." Jonathan arrived 10 minutes later, slightly winded from climbing the service stairs because the elevator was down. When he saw the dark corridors and the scattered beams of flashlights, he frowned. "Everyone all right?" he asked. "We're fine," Laura assured him. "We just need to reset the generator." Jonathan turned to her with a small smile. "You calm under pressure." "I have to be," she replied lightly. "Single mom. Restoration budgets, bills, panic is a luxury I can't afford." He chuckled. "Your resilience is remarkable." She opened her mouth to respond, but Anna tugged on her coat. "Mr. Jonathan," she said, flashlight in hand, shining it on the ceiling, "look. The shadows make it look like the building is telling a story." Jonathan glanced up at the flickering shadows stretching across the old moldings. "She's not wrong," he murmured. "This place does have a story," and then he looked at Laura. "You're the one helping it speak again." After the power returned, they continued their inspection of the east corridor, and that was when Laura made one of the most significant discoveries yet. Hidden behind a false wall was a narrow staircase that hadn't been touched in decades. Dust blanketed every step like thick snow, but at the top of the stairs, partially concealed beneath grime, was a set of tall arched windows made of stained glass, intricate, breathtaking, and nearly intact. "Oh my God," Laura whispered. She climbed the steps slowly, brushing her fingers across the colored panes. Sunlight filtered through the dust, casting blurred jewel-toned patterns across her face. Jonathan watched from below, his breath catching. Not because of the stained glass, though it was magnificent, but because of Laura. The way her eyes lit up. The way she seemed to come alive in moments of discovery. The building wasn't the only thing being restored. When she descended the stairs, her voice trembled with excitement. "Jonathan, this changes everything. We need to protect this. These windows aren't just decorative, they're historical art. And the frame is hand-carved. Look at the joints, this is original craftsmanship. We need specialists, glass artisans, restoration experts. Then hire them," Jonathan said without hesitation. "Whoever you need." She blinked at him, overwhelmed by his trust. But their growing bond wasn't without complications. Word had spread within the corporate offices that Jonathan was unusually invested in Laura's project. Rumors flowed, some harmless, some malicious. The coup made passive remarks in board meetings about questionable favoritism. A few executives questioned whether Jonathan was letting personal sentiment cloud his judgment. Jonathan ignored them. But Laura sensed the whispers when she visited Hale Tower for the first time to review funding allocations. The suits, the polished shoes, the glass walls, everything about the office felt sterile and foreign compared to the dusty, vibrant life inside the 1895 building. Some employees stared too long. Others greeted her with thin smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She held her head high, but the weight of being an outsider pressed heavily against her ribs. When she met with Jonathan afterward, she didn't hide it. "I don't fit here," she admitted quietly as they stood near the large windows in his office. "Your board barely looked at me. Those who did seemed bothered I was even in the room." Jonathan's expression hardened. "They were wrong," he said firmly, and small-minded. "Maybe," she shrugged, "but perception matters in your world." "Then we'll change the perception," he replied. "Together." His confidence warmed her, but she couldn't ignore the fear that crept beneath her skin. She didn't want to be the reason Jonathan faced pushback or strain within his company. But she also couldn't deny how deeply the work fulfilled her. How right it felt. How much she needed to see it through. Meanwhile, the building continued to reveal more hidden details, carved signatures from artisans long gone, original floor tiles depicting Pacific Northwest landscapes, hand-pressed wallpaper beneath layers of paint. Every discovery filled Laura with awe, and every day Jonathan visited made them grow more connected, not romantically, not yet, but in trust, in admiration, in quiet, growing reliance on each other's presence. One evening, after the crew left, Laura remained in the building to catalog the newly uncovered artifacts. The light was dimming, the air cold enough for her breath to fog. Jonathan arrived unexpectedly with 2 cups of hot coffee. "You're still here," he said gently. She looked up from her notebook, surprised and grateful. "It's peaceful at this hour," she said. "You can hear the building breathe." Jonathan handed her a cup. "You redoing something extraordinary, you know." She laughed softly. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said quietly, "you re-giving this place a second life." She met his gaze and for the first time saw something vulnerable in his eyes. A flicker of yearning, not for her. Not exactly, but for connection, for purpose, for the sense of belonging he'd lost long before she entered his life. They stood there for a long moment, the silence warm rather than empty. Then Jonathan spoke again, softer. "I'm proud of you, Laura." Nobody had said those words to her since her father died. A tight knot formed in her chest. She swallowed. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as she walked home with Anna's hand in hers, Laura felt something shifting, like a door opening inside her that she hadn't dared touch in years. And across the city, Jonathan stared out at the skyline, the lights reflecting off the harbor, realizing something quietly profound. He was no longer visiting the building to see the progress. He was visiting to see her. Spring crept slowly into Seattle, melting the last traces of winter and wrapping the city in soft, hesitant warmth. The mornings grew brighter, the evenings stretched longer, and with each new day, the 1895 building seemed to transform a little more, not just through the physical restoration, but through the energy that pulsed inside it. The team's movements became more coordinated, their confidence rising with the steady progression of each completed section. But while the building evolved, something much deeper was shifting within Jonathan and Laura, something neither had spoken aloud, but both felt in the space between their conversations, their glances, their shared moments. It happened most noticeably on a Thursday afternoon. Jonathan arrived at the site to find Laura standing on the scaffolding, her face lit by the glow of sunlight streaming through the newly cleaned stained glass windows. She was directing two craftsmen below, her voice firm but patient. A few strands of hair had escaped her braid, brushing against her cheek as she leaned forward to examine the framework. Jonathan paused before entering, watching her with a quiet awe. He admired her strength, her precision, her ability to move seamlessly between leader, artisan, mother, and fighter without ever losing her grounding. She didn't see him as a billionaire. She didn't see him as a man with influence or power. She saw him as a person, something he had rarely experienced in his adult life. Laura noticed him only when she climbed down the scaffolding and turned toward the lobby, wiping dust from her palms onto her work jeans. "Jonathan," she called, her breath a little short from the height she descended. "You early today?" His heart lifted at the subtle warmth in her voice. "I missed the place," he said lightly, though what he meant was something else entirely, "and I wanted to see how things were coming along." She smiled, the kind that always softened him. "Come on, I'll show you." They walked together through the building. Laura pointed out the freshly restored banister, the newly reinforced beams, the original tiles her team had nearly finished cleaning. Jonathan asked questions, genuine ones, and listened to every word she said with the full attention of a man who found meaning in her passion. At one point, they stopped in the old ballroom, where sunlight spilled across the wooden floors in soft, golden streaks. The room was still half ruined, but the beauty was already returning. Laura stepped into the center, tilting her face toward the light. "My dad used to say that old buildings don't lose their soul," she murmured. "They just forget it for a while." Jonathan watched her, his chest tightening. "You re-helping this one, remember?" She looked back at him, eyes warm, thoughtful, searching. "You make it possible," she said. "You didn't have to give me this chance." "I won't forget that." "Laura," he said softly, "you earned it. You didn't need me to see your talent. You just needed someone to finally give you space to show it." Her gaze held his for a moment too long, long enough that both felt a subtle shift in the air. Then Anna came running down the corridor, shouting for her mother to see something upstairs, and the moment scattered but not the feeling. Over the next days, Jonathan found himself visiting more frequently, staying longer, lingering near the places where Laura worked. He told himself he was there to support the project, to observe progress, to ensure the board's funds were being used properly. But deep inside he knew better. He wanted to be near her, wanted to hear her voice, wanted to see the spark in her eyes when she uncovered a new detail of the building's past. He hadn't wanted to feel anything for anyone in years. He thought he was too old, too rigid, too worn by life to open his heart again. Yet Laura kept chipping away at the walls around him softly, unintentionally, but effectively. She felt it too, though she tried to hide it. Late at night, after Anna fell asleep, Laura sometimes found her thoughts drifting toward Jonathan's kindness, his steady presence, the gentleness hidden beneath his stern exterior. She remembered the way he watched her work, the way he listened like nothing else in the world mattered. She reminded herself that he was her employer, that their worlds were different, that she had responsibilities, fears, scars he didn't know about. She told herself to be cautious, and still her heart tugged toward him. One windy afternoon, a small accident occurred on site. A loose wooden beam slipped from a platform, crashing onto the ground only feet from where Anna had been stacking her crayons. Laura's heart leapt into her throat as she ran to her daughter, pulling her close, checking every inch of her. Anna was shaken but unharmed. Jonathan, who had just arrived moments before, rushed to them. He knelt beside Anna, his face pale. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice tight. Anna shook her head, burying her face in Laura's sweater. Laura looked at Jonathan with a mixture of fear, anger, and relief. "This place isn't safe for kids anymore," she whispered. "I shouldn't have brought her today." Jonathan put a steady hand on her shoulder. "Accidents happen," he said gently. "But she's okay. You're both okay." The warmth of his touch steadied her more than she expected. She met his eyes, and an unspoken understanding passed between them, one filled with concern, vulnerability, and something deeper neither dared name. Jonathan insisted on driving them home. The car ride was quiet at first, with Anna falling asleep in the back seat. Laura stared out the window, her thoughts heavy. "Jonathan," she said softly, "I'm grateful for everything. But I need to be careful. I have to think about Anna, her safety, her stability." He nodded. "I understand. And about us," she added, voice barely audible. His breath caught. "Us," he repeated. "Whatever this is," she said, gesturing vaguely between them. "I don't know what it means. Or what it could mean." Jonathan gripped the steering wheel, his voice low. "Neither do I, but I know I care about you. I know I want you in my life." Laura swallowed. "That's complicated." "Yes," he agreed, "but worth navigating." She didn't answer, not with words. But her silence wasn't rejection, it was fear, hesitation, hope tangled together. When they arrived at her building, he helped her carry sleeping Anna upstairs. At the door, Laura paused. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for being there." Jonathan nodded. "Always." The word hung between them, trembling with possibility. As she closed the door behind her, Laura leaned against it, exhaling long and slow. She wasn't falling in love with him. Not yet. But she could feel the foundation beneath her shifting. And across the city, Jonathan sat in his car, staring at the steering wheel as a realization washed through him with quiet certainty. This woman, this strong, brilliant, resilient woman, was changing him, not with grand gestures, not with intention, but simply by being exactly who she was. And he wasn't sure if he was ready. But he knew he wanted to be. The tension between Jonathan and Laura didn't erupt suddenly, it built slowly, like a rising tide nudging at a shore that wasn't ready to shift yet. After the near accident with Anna, Jonathan became more protective, more deliberate, more present in ways he hadn't been before. He visited the building almost daily, not just to observe the restoration but to check on Laura, on her team, on Anna whenever she accompanied her mother. At first, Laura appreciated it. His presence grounded her, reassured her. But gradually she noticed the way workers straightened whenever he entered, how conversations quieted, how people deferred to him even though she was the project lead. It wasn't his fault he never commanded attention. He never undermined her, but his influence radiated naturally. And Laura began to worry that his presence, no matter how well-meaning, might shift the balance she'd worked so hard to build. She had fought too long to be taken seriously, to risk looking like she owed her authority to a powerful man. It came to a boiling point on a windy Monday morning when she was coordinating structural reinforcement in the southwest corridor. The sound of drills echoed down the hall, dust swirling in pale beams of sunlight. Her team was waiting for her direction on how to proceed with a precarious support beam, and Laura was mid-explanation when Jonathan arrived earlier than expected. The second he stepped in, the room changed, subtle but undeniable. The foreman paused. Two younger workers glanced at each other. Someone lowered their drill mid-motion. Laura felt it immediately, the shift of attention away from her and toward him. The invisible hierarchy reasserting itself, even though Jonathan had given her full authority. She tried to continue, but the foreman's eyes kept flicking between her and Jonathan, uncertain whom to follow. Jonathan noticed the tension and offered a gentle smile. "Don't let me interrupt. Please continue." But the interruption had already lodged itself in the room. Laura's jaw tightened. She forced herself through the explanation, but her voice faltered in ways it never had before. After the team dispersed to begin the task, she turned to Jonathan, attempting to keep her tone controlled. "You didn't need to come this early," she said. "I wanted to see the beam before reinforcement," he replied, unaware of the storm building inside her. "The structure here is more fragile than we thought." "I know," she said evenly. "That's why I was explaining the plan." Jonathan nodded. "And you were doing an excellent job." "I didn't want to step on anything." She almost believed him. But then the foreman returned with a question and directed it to Jonathan. "Not her." Jonathan immediately gestured toward Laura. "Ask your project director. She's the one in charge." But the damage was done. Laura felt heat rising in her chest, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. When the foreman walked away, Laura drew a slow breath. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "I need you to give me space to lead." He blinked, genuinely confused. "I have been." "Not enough," she replied, her voice low. "Not when everyone defers to you by default. Not when your presence shifts how people treat me." He frowned, stepping closer. "Laura, if anyone disrespected you, they were not disrespecting me," she cut in. "They're reacting to you. You walk into a room, and decades of your authority follow. Whether you mean to or not, you overshadow me." Jonathan stiffened, hurt flickering across his face. "I'm trying to support you." "I know," she said, softer now. "But support and hovering aren't the same thing." For a long moment, neither spoke. Workers hammered in the distance. Dust drifted across a slanted beam of sunlight. Jonathan searched her face, trying to understand the wound beneath her words. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he finally said. "I would never want that." Laura nodded, her eyes softening even though frustration still simmered beneath the surface. "I know your intentions are good, they always are. But your presence changes the room. And I need this project to be mine. I need to prove myself not just to the board or the team, but to myself." Jonathan looked down at his cane, gripping it more tightly. "Are you saying you don't want me here?" The vulnerability in his voice surprised her. She softened a little, shaking her head. "No. I'm saying I need you here differently." He raised his eyes, meeting hers. "How?" She hesitated, struggling to articulate the complicated truth. "Be here as Jonathan, not as Hale Properties, not as the man with influence, not as the weight people silence themselves around. Be here as you." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in his defenses, equal parts relief and something deeper she couldn't quite name. "I didn't realize I was making your job harder," he murmured. "I only wanted to help." "You were helping," she said. "But sometimes helping means stepping back." Jonathan inhaled slowly, letting her words settle. He wasn't used to stepping back. He wasn't used to not being the solution. But this wasn't business, this was personal, and he cared about Laura too much to let his presence unintentionally undermine her. "I'll give you space," he said. "Tell me when you want me here, when you don't. I'll follow your lead." She felt a knot loosen in her chest. "Thank you." But beneath the relief was something more complicated, because once again, Jonathan had responded with humility and sincerity. And that made pushing him away even harder. For a few days, Jonathan reduced his visits. He still checked in, but by text or short calls. He stayed in the background, letting her direct the project fully. Laura noticed the change immediately. Her team grew more confident around her. The foreman deferred to her without hesitation, and she flourished. Her leadership sharpened, her voice stronger. Yet with each day Jonathan stayed away, an ache grew quietly inside her. She hadn't expected to miss him so much. She hadn't expected the silence he left behind to feel heavier than his presence ever had. One late afternoon, after a long day of work, she sat alone in the restored ballroom, staring up at the sunlit-stained glass. Her hands were dusty. Her hair was a mess. But her heart felt restless. She reached for her phone before she could talk herself out of it. "Are you busy?" she typed. Jonathan replied instantly, "Never too busy for you." Her heart stuttered. "Can you stop by? Not for work. Just come as you." His response came fast. "On my way." When he arrived, he found her sitting on the floor amid scattered tools and blueprints. She looked tired, overwhelmed, and beautiful in a way that caught him off guard. "I missed this," she admitted softly. "I missed you." Jonathan's breath faltered. He sat beside her, careful, close enough to feel her warmth. I missed you too. They didn't touch. They didn't cross any lines. But in the golden quiet of the fading afternoon, sitting shoulder to shoulder on the old ballroom floor, something passed between them, a gentle, undeniable shift. Something that felt like the beginning of a truth neither of them could outrun much longer. Spring eventually softened into early summer, and with it came a brightness that seeped into every corner of the 1895 building. By June, the restoration was no longer just a project, it had become a living rhythm, a pulse that flowed naturally through the days. The workers moved with a practiced ease, the stained glass sparkled, the hallways breathed again. And the root of decay had been replaced with careful renewal. But just as the building found its second life, something parallel was happening inside Jonathan and Laura. Their bond had deepened slowly, gently, almost imperceptibly but undeniably. They spent more evenings together now, lingering long after the workers had left, sharing coffee on dusty staircases or walking through the quiet halls with flashlights, discovering details nobody else cared to notice. They talked in deeper ways as well, about their pasts, their fears, their regrets, their hopes. And it was during one of those late evenings, warm light spilling through the newly restored windows, the building humming with quiet accomplishment, that the moment arrived. Not with fireworks, not with dramatics, but with truth. Jonathan had come to check progress on the ballroom flooring, and Laura was already there, kneeling beside a newly polished section, running her fingers over the smooth grain. The boards had once been cracked and warped, but now they gleamed under the chandelier she'd chosen, a vintage piece restored by hand. Jonathan paused at the doorway, watching her with a quiet awe he could no longer hide. "You've transformed this place," he said softly. Laura looked up, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "We've transformed it." "No," he said, stepping inside. "This is your masterpiece." She smiled, but it didn't fully reach her eyes. There was something deeper there, a vulnerability that seemed newly exposed. "Jonathan," she said after a moment, her voice quieter than usual, "can I ask you something?" "Anything," he replied. She rose from the floor, dusting her hands on her jeans, and walked toward one of the tall windows. The fading light framed her silhouette as she exhaled slowly. "What happens when this is finished?" she asked. Jonathan stepped closer. "You mean the project, I mean us." The question hit him with full force, not painfully but truthfully. He'd known it was coming. He had felt it in every stolen glance, every quiet conversation, every time her shoulder brushed his while they worked side by side. He walked toward her slowly, his cane tapping lightly on the restored floor. When he stopped beside her, their reflections stood together in the glass, two people from different worlds, different pasts, and yet somehow aligned in this moment. "What do you think should happen?" he asked gently. Laura didn't answer immediately. She looked out at the city, at the skyline glowing under the sunset, at the life happening beyond the walls they'd brought back to life. "I've been afraid," she admitted finally. "Not of you, not of us, but of believing that something good could actually stay." Jonathan's chest tightened. "You deserve something good that stays." She turned to him, eyes shining with a quiet H. "So do you." He didn't look away, he didn't shift. He let her see everything in his eyes, the loneliness he'd lived with, the hope she'd revived, the gratitude he felt for her simply existing in his life. "Laura," he said, his voice low but steady, "my life was empty before you walked into that restaurant. I had success, I had money, I had a legacy. But I didn't have anything that made waking up feel like a gift." He reached for her hand slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like they had been reaching for each other long before this moment. "You changed that," he continued. "You and Anna. You brought warmth back into my world. You reminded me that life doesn't end just because it hurts." Laura swallowed, emotion rising in her chest. "Jonathan, I don't want to be something temporary in your life. You aren't. I don't want to be someone people say you chose out of loneliness or gratitude. You not. I need to know," she whispered, "that you see me not the carpenter you helped, not the woman you rescued, but me." Jonathan stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the sincerity in his presence. "I see you," he said, "more clearly than I've seen anyone in years." Her breath trembled, not from fear, but from relief, from something that felt dangerously like hope. "I'm older than you think I am," she said, almost joking but not quite. "And I'm older than I feel," he replied, smiling softly. She laughed, a small, warm, disarming sound. I'm complicated, she confessed. So am I. Have a daughter, she added. I know, he said, and she's one of the best things about you. Lara blinked, touched. You say that like it's obvious. It is. Silence settled gently between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came before truth. And then, without rush, without fear, Jonathan lifted her hand and held it against his chest right where his heart beat steady and strong. Lara, he said softly, I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know how much time I have. But I know this, whatever time I do have, I want it to include you. Her eyes filled, not with sadness but with something deeper: recognition, acceptance, love in its earliest form, tender and unforced. She stepped closer, her free hand rising to rest against his jaw. Jonathan, his name was almost a sigh, a promise wrapped in breath. And then she kissed him. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't urgent. It was warm, slow, steady, a kiss built from trust, gratitude, longing, and the gentle certainty that this moment had been growing between them for months. Jonathan cupped the back of her neck tenderly, pulling her just a little closer. The building around them seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging the new chapter unfolding within its restored walls. When they parted, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, hearts steadying. Lara laughed softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. I didn't plan that. Neither did I, Jonathan murmured, brushing his thumb along her skin. But I'm glad it happened. So am I, she whispered. They stood that way for a long moment, wrapped in the warmth of the fading sunset and the beginning of something real. When the workers returned the next morning, something in the atmosphere had shifted, not visibly, not obviously, but in the quiet way people sense when hearts have aligned. Jonathan didn't hover. Lara didn't distance herself. They simply existed together, side by side, stronger for having crossed that invisible threshold. Anna knew immediately, of course. Children always do. She saw the way Jonathan looked at her mother, the softness, the lightness, the quiet joy. Mom, she whispered later that week, tugging Laura's sleeve, do you like him? Lara smiled, her heart full. Yes, she said gently. I think I really do, Anna grinned. Good. Because I do too. And as summer continued to bloom around Seattle, as the building neared completion, as the city prepared to celebrate its restored landmark, one thing became clear. This wasn't the ending of their story. It was the beginning. The story of Jonathan Hale and Lara Bennett is, at its core, a reminder that healing often arrives in the most unexpected forms and at the most unexpected moments in life. Jonathan, a man surrounded by wealth, influence, and prestige, had every material comfort imaginable, but his heart had lived in a quiet winter for years. His life was filled with meetings, contracts, boardrooms, and a penthouse that echoed with absence more than luxury. Yet it was the simple kindness of a little girl, the bravery of a mother trying her best, and the spark of unexpected connection that thawed the loneliness he had convinced himself was permanent. The lesson here is one that often gets lost in the noise of modern life. No amount of success can replace genuine human connection, and sometimes the greatest transformations begin with something as small as a child offering a handmade card to a stranger who needed it more than he realized. For Lara, the story reflects a different truth, one about courage, resilience, and the power of being seen for who you truly are. She had spent years fighting for survival, working job to job, navigating life as a single mother with no safety net, no privilege, no recognition. The world had never made room for her dreams, so she learned to carry them quietly, buried beneath responsibility. Jonathan's belief in her was the first time anyone truly acknowledged her gifts, not as favors, not as pity, but as genuine worth. Her journey teaches us that sometimes people don't grow because they are incapable, but because no one has ever given them the space to bloom, and more importantly, that when someone finally does see your potential, the hardest part is believing it yourself. Lara had to confront not the building she was restoring, but the internal structure of insecurity and self-doubt built by years of struggle. Her arc reveals that accepting opportunity can be as brave as surviving hardship, and that allowing yourself to rise is not betrayal of your past but honor to it. Together, Jonathan and Lara's connection becomes a lesson about how two wounded lives, different in every way, can help rebuild one another without trying to fix or control. Jonathan never tried to mold Lara into someone else. He valued her exactly as she was, with rough hands and stubborn pride. Lara never tried to soften Jonathan's guarded exterior. She met him where he stood and gradually helped him step into the kind of life that held warmth again. Their story shows that healing doesn't require perfection or matching backgrounds or carefully planned intentions. It requires presence, consistency, honesty, and the courage to let someone close enough to see the cracks you don't show the world. Love in this story is not dramatic or possessive, it is restorative. It is two people choosing, slowly and gently, to be better because of each other. There is also a lesson in the building they restored together. The 1895 structure, forgotten by the city and nearly lost to neglect, mirrors both of their lives. What others saw as a decaying relic, Jonathan and Laura saw as something worth saving. They recognized the hidden beauty under the dust, the craftsmanship beneath the damage, the stories embedded in every worn beam and carved detail. Through their project, the narrative teaches us that age, brokenness, and imperfection do not diminish value. Sometimes the most meaningful things require patience, attention, and care to reveal their true brilliance. And just like the building, people, even those who have been abandoned by life's hardships, can rediscover their light when someone invests time and belief in them. Restoration, whether of structures or souls, is slow, delicate, and deliberate. But when done with love, it brings back more than what was lost. It brings back what was forgotten. Anna's presence is perhaps the simplest but most profound lesson of all. Children often see truths adults miss. She recognized Jonathan's loneliness instantly. She bridged the distance between strangers with instinctive kindness. Her boldness, innocence, and compassion remind us that empathy does not need age or experience, it only needs a willing heart. Her role demonstrates that sometimes the smallest voices bring about the biggest changes. And more beautifully, she reminds us that family is not defined solely by blood but by connection, trust, and choice. Ultimately, the story teaches that life offers second chances, sometimes long after we've stopped expecting them. Jonathan learned that it was never too late to rediscover meaning, to open his heart again, or to start a new chapter filled with purpose rather than status. Laura learned that struggle does not disqualify you from joy, that your past does not make you unworthy of your future, and that even after years of survival mode living, you can still step into a life built on hope instead of fear. Together they learned that love can arrive quietly, like a soft snowfall on Christmas Eve, and slowly build into something strong enough to rebuild the foundations of a wounded heart. The greater lesson is this: kindness is powerful, opportunity is transformational, and love honest, patient, steadfast. Love has the ability to restore the parts of us we thought were beyond repair. Life might break us in different ways, but it also has a way of bringing the right people at the right time, offering us the tools to rebuild. Just as the old building was revived through attention, care, and belief, so too can people be renewed when someone finally looks at them and says, "You matter. You are capable. You are worth saving, and you don't have to do this alone." And perhaps that is the true heart of the story. No one is beyond restoration, not a broken building, not a weary billionaire, not a struggling mother, and not a little girl searching for a place to belong. All it takes is the courage to let light in, even through cracked windows. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming videos. If you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd really love to hear your feedback. Thank you for watching until the end.